Derby Family Massacre. It made detectives cry. A quiet town's dark secret. The small town of Derby had always been known for its peace and charm, nestled between rolling hills and vast farmlands. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life moved slowly and nothing ever seemed to go wrong. That was until the events of one chilling autumn night shook the town to its core. The massacre at the Derby family estate would become the darkest stain on the town's history, a case so disturbing it brought even the most seasoned detectives to tears. Detective Sarah Hayes, a veteran investigator, arrived at the crime scene just as the sun began to rise. The first responders, officers who had seen their share of tragedies, stood pale and shaken outside the large Derby mansion. Sarah knew instantly that this was not going to be an ordinary case. As she walked toward the house, the air seemed to thicken with an almost palpable sense of dread. Detective, Officer Johnson greeted her, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled as he pointed towards the front door. You need to see this for yourself." Sarah nodded and stepped into the grand hallway of the Derby estate. The house, once filled with warmth and luxury, now felt cold, like a tomb. Her sharp eyes took in the details immediately. The untouched family portraits lining the walls, the broken vase near the staircase, the faint smell of copper that always accompanied a scene like this. In the living room, the massacre unfolded before her eyes. The Derby family, Roger, his wife Linda, and their two children, Emily and Jake, lay scattered across the room in positions too horrific to describe. Blood splattered the once pristine white walls, and the evidence of struggle was everywhere. The room was a war zone, but there was something strange, something deliberate about the way they had been left. Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She had seen murders before, but nothing like this. The family had not just been killed, they had been butchered. The sheer brutality of it was overwhelming, and yet there were no signs of forced entry. No clear motive. No obvious explanation. She crouched near Roger Derby's body, her eyes scanning for any clues. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, his hands curled as though he had tried to defend himself in his final moments. Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. What kind of person could have done this?
And why?
Officer Johnson stepped in behind her, his voice quivering. The neighbors didn't hear anything. Not a single sound. It's like it just happened in silence. Sarah stood, her mind racing with possibilities. "That's impossible," she muttered, looking at the scene again. The level of violence, the chaos, it should have been loud. Gunshots, screams, yet no one had heard a thing. A strange thought crossed her mind. What if the killer had planned it that way? What if this massacre wasn't just an act of rage, but something more? Something calculated? The silence was almost too much. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls were hiding secrets too horrible to speak of. Sarah felt the weight of the case pressing down on her, knowing this was only the beginning of something much darker. Just as she turned to leave the room, a soft creak echoed from above, coming from the second floor. Her heart skipped a beat. The house had been cleared, hadn't it? She glanced at Officer Johnson, who was now pale as a ghost. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah nodded, gripping her flashlight tighter. She motioned for him to follow as she carefully made her way up the grand staircase, each step echoing louder in the silence of the mansion. At the top, the hallways stretched long and dark, with doors leading to the family's bedrooms. The creak came again, this time from the far end of the hallway. Sarah motioned for Johnson to cover the stairs as she approached the source of the noise, a door slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat as she pushed it open, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Inside, the room was empty except for a single object lying in the center of the floor, a small, blood-stained teddy bear. Sarah's pulse quickened as she crouched down, examining it. This wasn't just any teddy bear. It belonged to Jake, the youngest of the Derby family. She had seen it in the family portraits. As she stood, a cold gust of wind brushed past her, and the door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. Sarah jumped, her heart racing. She immediately yanked the door open, expecting to find someone, or something, on the other side. But the hallway was empty, and Officer Johnson stood at the top of the stairs, his face drained of color. "Detective, there's something wrong with this place," he stammered, backing away from the hallway. Something very wrong. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. This wasn't just a crime scene. It felt like something darker was at play, something that didn't want them there. And the deeper she dug, the more certain she became that this was only the beginning. The massacre of the Derby family would soon unravel into a case that none of them were prepared for, a case that would haunt them all. The Forgotten Witness. The investigation into the Derby Family Massacre intensified with every passing hour. The investigation into the Derby Family Massacre intensified with every passing hour. Detective Sarah Hayes had seen plenty of gruesome cases in her career, but something about this one gnawed at her relentlessly. As she descended the stairs back to the ground floor, her thoughts circled around that blood-stained teddy bear, the eerie gust of wind, and the way the door had slammed shut with a violence that didn't belong in the silence of the mansion. Every piece of the puzzle fell off, disconnected, yet somehow bound together by a thread she couldn't yet see. The forensic team arrived shortly after Sarah's unsettling experience upstairs. Flashbulbs illuminated the crime scene as they began photographing the carnage, methodically collecting evidence. Officer Johnson, still shaken, stood by the front door, his face pale as if the life had drained out of him entirely. "Detective," a voice called from the doorway. It was Captain Dawson, head of the department, and a man Sarah respected deeply. His usual stoic demeanor had cracked, and his eyes revealed a deeper worry than she had ever seen before. "Captain," Sarah greeted him, walking over to meet him at the front entrance. This is unlike anything I've ever seen." Captain Dawson nodded grimly, looking past her into the blood-stained living room. "We've got the media circling outside, and every reporter in the state is itching to get their hands on this story. But this case, it's not just about a brutal murder anymore. This is going to shake everyone. I need you on this, Sarah. No distractions. Find out who did this." Sarah gave a firm nod, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was about to unravel in ways no one expected. There was something she wasn't seeing yet, something that would change everything. As the hours wore on, Sarah returned to the police station to comb through the initial findings. The autopsy reports had yet to come in, but the forensic team had already flagged one crucial piece of evidence, a single set of fingerprints found on the blood-stained teddy bear. It wasn't Roger's, Linda's, or either of the children's. It was someone else's, someone who had been inside that house close to the family. The news gave her a small glimmer of hope, but it wasn't much. There were no suspects, no motive. She needed more. Something tangible. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the office door. Officer Johnson stepped in, his face still strained. "Detective, we may have a witness. Someone who might have seen something the night of the massacre." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Who?" He hesitated before answering. "There's an old man who lives just down the road from the Derby estate. Name's Mr. Clarence Owen. He called earlier, said he saw something strange the night it happened." But Johnson paused, his voice uncertain. "He's known around town for being a bit off. The kind of guy who sees things that aren't really there." "Did you talk to him?" Sarah asked. "I tried, but he insisted on speaking to you. Says it's important." Sarah grabbed her coat and keys. "Then let's not waste any time." The drive to Clarence Owen's house was short, but the tension mounted with every passing minute. The old man's home was a decrepit farmhouse, weathered and worn by years of neglect. A single porch light flickered in the dim evening light, casting long shadows across the lawn. As they approached the door, Sarah knocked firmly. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Clarence, a man well into his 80s, with wild, unkempt hair and a frail frame. His eyes, though clouded with age, sparkled with an intensity that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "You're the detective, aren't you?" Clarence said, his voice raspy but firm.
"Come in.
"We need to talk." Sarah and Johnson exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The air inside the house was musty, filled with the scent of dust and old wood. Clarence led them to a small living room cluttered with books, old photographs, and odd trinkets. He sat down heavily in a worn armchair, gesturing for them to take a seat across from him. "I've lived in Derby my whole life," Clarence began, his gaze fixed on a point far in the distance. "I've seen a lot of things in this town, things most people would never believe. But what I saw that night, what I heard, there's something wrong with that house." Sarah leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What did you see, Mr. Owen?" Clarence's hands shook as he placed them on his knees, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I couldn't sleep that night. Storm was rolling in, wind howling outside. But then I heard something different. It was quiet at first, like a low hum. But it wasn't the wind." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of hum?" "Like something unnatural," Clarence said, his eyes locking with hers. "It came from the Derby house. I looked out my window, and I swear to God, Detective, I saw shadows moving inside, like people were walking through the rooms. But the house was dark. No lights. And then I saw it." Sarah held her breath. "Saw what?" Clarence leaned in closer, his voice trembling. "A figure. Tall, dark, standing just outside their front door. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching the house. And then it disappeared, like smoke in the wind." Silence filled the room as Sarah processed his words. A figure? Watching the house? The hum he described, it didn't make sense. But the look in Clarence's eyes told her he wasn't lying. He had seen something, even if it sounded impossible. "There's something evil in that house," Clarence continued, his voice shaking. "Something that doesn't want you to find the truth. And if you keep digging, Detective, it'll come for you too." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the first time she had heard someone say something like that during an investigation, but this felt different. The fear in Clarence's voice was real. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Owen," Sarah said, standing up. "We'll look into what you've told us." As she and Johnson walked back to the car, the weight of the case pressed down on her even harder. Something was deeply wrong with this investigation. But whatever it was, Sarah knew one thing. They were only scratching the surface of a nightmare far worse than they had imagined. The silent threat. Detective Sarah Hayes sat in her car, staring at the dashboard, replaying Clarence Owen's words over and over in her mind. The figure he had seen, the hum he had heard, it sounded absurd, something out of a horror movie. Yet, there was something about his demeanor that troubled her deeply. She had dealt with countless witnesses over the years, but the fear in Clarence's eyes was different. Genuine. Beside her, Officer Johnson shifted uncomfortably, still pale from their conversation. "What do you think, Detective? You think the old man's losing it, or is there something to this?" Sarah sighed, gripping the steering wheel. "I don't know, Johnson, but we can't ignore it. If there's even a shred of truth to what he's saying, we're missing something important." Johnson glanced back at the farmhouse, where Clarence had already closed the door, as if shutting himself off from the world outside. He mentioned that hum. What could cause that? Electrical interference? Some kind of equipment? Sarah shrugged, turning the key in the ignition. Maybe. Or maybe it's something we're not seeing yet. She pulled out of the driveway, her mind swirling with questions. As they drove back toward the station, the dark sky loomed overhead, thick clouds threatening a storm. Sarah couldn't help but think of the eerie wind Clarence had described. Her logical mind rejected the idea of something supernatural, but after years of investigating heinous crimes, she had learned that sometimes reality was more twisted than any fiction. The Derby family's case was unraveling into something far more complex. With no motive, no clear suspects, and now this strange testimony from Clarence, the case was spinning into the unknown. Sarah felt like she was grasping at shadows. Back at the station, Sarah and Johnson parted ways. She sat down at her desk, opening her laptop to review the evidence once more. The forensics team had done a thorough job. Photos of the crime scene, blood spatter analysis, details about the weapon used. But there was still no solid lead. The fingerprints on the teddy bear were a clue, but without a match in the system, they were chasing a ghost. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The hum Clarence had described gnawed at her. What if it wasn't just his imagination? What if there was something inside the house? Something they had missed? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone vibrating on the desk. She glanced at the caller ID. It was Dr. Morrison, the chief medical examiner. Detective Hayes, she answered, her voice sharp with anticipation. Sarah, I've just finished the preliminary autopsy reports on the Derby family, Dr. Morrison said. There was a tension in his voice that Sarah didn't like. And? She prompted, sitting up straighter. There's something you need to see, he replied, his tone grave. It's not normal. Sarah wasted no time heading to the coroner's office. Dr. Morrison was waiting for her, his face tight with concern as he guided her to the examination room where the bodies of the Derby family were laid out on metal tables. What did you find? Sarah asked, scanning the room with a sense of unease. Morrison didn't answer right away. Instead, he led her to Roger Derby's body, pulling back the sheet to reveal a series of deep lacerations across his torso. The cause of death is clear: multiple stab wounds, likely inflicted by the same sharp object. But that's not what's unusual. He pointed to a strange mark just beneath Roger's ribs, a circular bruise with a faint red line running through it. This isn't from the weapon, Morrison explained. I've never seen anything like it. It almost looks electrical. Electrical? Sarah frowned, leaning in closer to examine the mark. It did resemble a burn, but it wasn't from a fire or a heat source. The edges were too precise. Not only that, Morrison continued, moving to Linda's body. Each member of the family has the same mark in nearly the exact same spot. Emily, Jake, all of them. Sarah's stomach turned. What are you saying, Morrison? I don't know yet, he admitted, but whatever this is, it wasn't caused by anything we can easily explain. And there's more. The bruising around the wounds is odd. The patterns are too uniform, almost as if it wasn't done by human hands. Sarah finished his sentence, her mind racing. Morrison nodded slowly. Exactly. Sarah felt the weight of the discovery hit her like a tidal wave. The case had taken a turn she hadn't expected, one that hinted at something far more sinister. The precise marks, the eerie hum, the shadow Clarence had seen. Were these things connected? Or was she being drawn into a rabbit hole of paranoia? Her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. She answered quickly, her heart already pounding. Detective Hayes, it's Officer Johnson, came the voice on the other end, sounding rattled. You need to get to the Derby house. Right now. Sarah's pulse quickened. What happened? There's been a break-in, Johnson replied, his voice tense. And it looks like whoever it was didn't leave empty-handed. When Sarah arrived at the Derby estate, the house was alive with activity. Flashlights cut through the darkness as officers scoured the grounds. The front door, which had been secured earlier, now hung open, the lock clearly tampered with. Johnson met her at the entrance, his face pale in the dim light. Whoever did this knew what they were looking for, he said grimly. They didn't trash the place. They went straight for the study and took something. Sarah's brow furrowed. What did they take? Johnson led her inside, up the grand staircase, and into Roger Derby's private study. The room was meticulously organized, books neatly stacked on shelves, papers in perfect order. But one of the drawers in the desk was pulled open, the contents missing. It was locked, Johnson explained. We didn't even think to check it before, but now it's gone. Sarah approached the desk, her heart pounding. What was in it? A small box, Johnson replied, according to the Derby family lawyer. It was supposed to contain personal documents, but he was vague about what exactly. Sarah clenched her fists. Someone had broken into the house, not just to steal, but to erase something. A key piece of evidence, something that Roger Derby had hidden away. And now it was gone. The missing piece. Sarah stood in the middle of the study, her eyes scanning the room, her thoughts racing. The silence was deafening. Someone had targeted this house, not for random valuables, but for something specific, something that Roger Derby had deemed important enough to lock away. And now it was gone, leaving them grasping at shadows. Who knew about this box? Sarah asked, breaking the heavy silence. She turned to Officer Johnson, who was standing by the door, still pale from the break-in. The family lawyer mentioned it, Johnson said. But he wasn't clear on the details, just that it contained personal documents. Whatever was in there, it was significant enough for someone to risk coming back for it after the murders. Sarah's mind raced. A family brutally murdered, and now the theft of a mystery box containing personal documents. Could the two be connected? And what could possibly be inside that box that someone was so desperate to retrieve? Get in touch with the lawyer, Sarah ordered. I want a full rundown on what was in that box. Everything. No more vague answers. Johnson nodded and hurried out of the room, leaving Sarah alone. She walked over to the desk, running her fingers along the smooth wood. There were no signs of struggle here, no indication that anything had been disturbed aside from the drawer. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were after and how to get it without leaving much of a trace. A strange feeling gnawed at her gut, something she couldn't quite put into words. It was as though the house itself was holding on to secrets, secrets that someone was willing to kill for. And now, with the missing documents, those secrets were even more elusive. She took a deep breath, pushing back the growing frustration. There had to be a way to piece this all together. Clarence's eerie testimony, the strange hum, the peculiar electrical burns on the bodies, everything was connected. But how? Just as she was about to leave the study, her phone buzzed. It was Johnson again, his voice tense. "Detective, the lawyer's coming in to speak with us first thing tomorrow morning," he said. "But there's something else. We got a lead on the fingerprints from the teddy bear." Sarah's heart skipped a beat.
"Tell me."
Match came back. "It's not in the system, but the print belongs to a local contractor. Name's Isaac Ward. He was doing renovations for the Derby family about 2 months before the murders." Sarah clenched her jaw. Finally, a break. "Where is he now?" "We're tracking him down," Johnson replied. "He's got a small place on the outskirts of town. I'll send a unit to bring him in for questioning." "Good," Sarah said, feeling the rush of adrenaline as the pieces began to shift. "I want to talk to him as soon as possible." Hours later, Isaac Ward sat across from Sarah in the interrogation room, his face haggard and his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and grease-stained clothes. His hands, calloused from years of labor, fidgeted on the table in front of him. "Isaac," Sarah began, her voice steady but firm, "we found your fingerprints at the Derby house. You want to tell me what you were doing there?" Isaac swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. I didn't do anything, detective. I was hired to do some work on their roof. That's all."
"I swear."
"And when was this?" Sarah asked, leaning forward, her eyes boring into him. "Couple months ago," Isaac replied, his voice shaky. "I haven't been back since. I heard about the murders. It's horrible what happened to them. But I swear, I had nothing to do with it." Sarah wasn't buying it. "Then why were your fingerprints found on a toy in the children's bedroom?" Isaac's eyes widened in surprise.
"A toy?"
I don't know. Maybe I touched it by accident while I was inside. They had me fix a leak in the ceiling near the kids' room." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "You expect me to believe that? That you just happened to leave your fingerprints on a teddy bear in the middle of a brutal murder scene?" Isaac's face turned pale, his breathing quickening. "I'm telling you the truth, detective. I don't know how my prints ended up there. I was never in their bedroom." Sarah studied him closely. He was clearly terrified, but fear alone didn't make someone guilty. Still, the timing was too perfect, the evidence too damning. "Did you know about the box that was stolen from the Derby house?" she asked, her voice low, almost predatory. Isaac shook his head furiously.
"No."
"No, I don't know anything about a box. I didn't take anything. Please, you have to believe me." Sarah wasn't convinced. There was something about his desperation that rang hollow, as if he were hiding more than he was letting on. But she needed proof, something concrete to tie him to the massacre, or to exonerate him. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're not going anywhere, Isaac. We're going to keep you here until we figure this out." Isaac's eyes filled with panic. "Please, detective, I didn't do it. I swear on my life. I had nothing to do with the Derby family's deaths." Sarah walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. She could hear Isaac's frantic pleas echoing through the hallway, but she couldn't afford to get emotional. She had to stay focused. As she headed back to her office, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from the station's tech team. They had pulled security footage from a traffic camera near the Derby house on the night of the break-in. Sarah's stomach tightened as she opened the file, watching the grainy black and white footage. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, walked up to the house, disappearing into the shadows. Moments later, they emerged, carrying a small object, likely the missing box. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the figure or the box. It was the faint flicker of lights around the house. The hum, just like Clarence Owen had described.